Eberhard, or I should say good afternoon, or I know you are not in India anymore, so now you are in France, back from India. First of all, thank you very much for having accepted this interview. So you are a law anthropologist and more specifically a guest researcher and professor in anthropology and theory of the law at the University of Saint-Louis in Brussels. You are also a guest professor at the European Academy of Law Theory in Brussels and member of the Legal Anthropology Laboratory of Paris. The first point I would like to discuss with you today is about the conciliation between the two fields in which you are working in. In fact, as you said in the preface of one of your books, Human Rights and Intercultural Dialogue, when you started your research for your thesis about human rights and the diversity of cultures, it was not easy to defend it and quite taboo. Some people were even asking you if you were supporting torture in the name of culture, for example. How did you prove the critics wrong?
And maybe the first thing which is important to keep in mind always is the context where you're doing things. So I was writing my thesis in France, which maybe in Europe is the most, let's say, universalistic country. It's maybe the country in Europe which has most problems with the recognition of cultural diversity or communities, so which is very much linked to the French world vision of la République, the Republic, and the unicité de la République, the unity of the Republic. So you don't have the same kind of thing in Belgium, where already you have different linguistic communities. You don't have the same thing in Austria. I'm Austrian basically, but we even have, it's a small country, but we have 9 federal states. So just to say that we should not forget about this context. So in France, indeed, so beginning of the 1990s, when I started to work on this question of human rights and intercultural dialogue, it was very difficult to be able to be heard. Because as soon as you put in the same sentence the idea of human rights and cultures, so human rights would be, I would say, the French self-identification. It's what is rational, what is universal, what is progressive, what is civilized. And if in the same title you would put cultures, the feeling would be that you try to put some communalism, some ghetto of particularisms, some archaic traditions, all that kind of things in. Because the French perception is very much this perception. So that is why, and especially so, that first context is the French context. Second context is that my thesis was a thesis in law. It was not a thesis in anthropology. So of course, if you're in France and if you wrote at that time maybe a research work in anthropology, it would have again been more easy to talk about culture, because anthropology is about culture. But law is not about culture, it is about how to organize a society, and how to organize it in the French view from the state point of view, from the universalistic point of view. And so because of these two reasons, so the French culture on the one hand and the legal context in which I was doing the work on the other, it was not only difficult to get heard, but actually when you were just mentioning that kind of questions, well, people were very much shocked. So the reactions that I got was, for example, oh, what are you working on? Oh, I work on human rights and cultural diversity, or human rights and cultures, or human rights intercultural dialogue. And immediately I would have reactions like, oh, so you're for excision, you're for torture, you're... I didn't even say what I'm going to look at or what I'm going to find. Just putting culture and human rights in the same problematique, as we would say in French, immediately triggered some very, very defensive reactions. So at the beginning this was a bit disconcerting for me, because I thought, like, isn't the university supposed to do research, and try to understand things? Also in 1993, so I started to work on these questions in like 94, 95, but in 1993 you had this World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, where for the first time, very loudly actually, there were some critiques on the Western character of human rights. So there were different countries who mentioned or pointed out that, well, it may be a Western thing and not a universal thing per se. And of course, there were some political reasons for this, but they also pointed some truth. So from that context, I thought, well, there's a question which is really there. It was even starting to become a global important question, as this conference in Vienna had shown. So for me, at the beginning, I really did not at all understand where the problem came from.
Okay.
Especially also being Austrian, and being an Austrian not completely sharing maybe the French worldview.
Yes,
you know?
okay.
So that's I was really unaware. Just said something and it triggered strange reactions. Then little by little I started to understand that for French people, or you could say more generally speaking, people who do, let's say the word, believe very much in human rights, well, human rights is not just a rational construct. It is something which is sacred. It's something which you believe in so much as other people would believe in their religions or something. But usually what we say is that you always feel that others believe. You know, you're Hindus, so you believe in Hinduism, or you're Christians, who believe in Christianism. But when we place ourselves on the side of, for example, human rights or democracy or development or science, then usually we do not assume that we also believe in this. We just feel that is the rational thing. That is the true thing. That is the objective thing to do. And so for me, what was very interesting is little by little to start to understand that actually having a dialogue means to, yes, on the one hand have a rational debate, very important, but on the other hand also to understand where people speak from. And also understanding that the point where people speak from may make certain things difficult to say or to be heard. Because let's put it like in a word, in a nutshell, because it's taboo to talk about this.
Yes.
Unthinkable to question certain things. And I must admit, even for myself, before starting to work explicitly on the question of human rights and intercultural dialogue, I never thought that you could actually rethink human rights in a different way. For me, like, human rights was always something which is floating up there, some rules which cannot be touched, which are beyond even the normal law, something like this. And in my laboratory of legal anthropology in the Université Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne, that I discovered that you actually were able to think about these things. And how did I discover it? Because my professor, Etienne Leroy, had been invited to Institut International des Droits de l'Homme à Strasbourg to give classes on the anthropology of human rights. So I tried to see all these questions. Are human rights universal? Are they not universal? Can they be made universal? What is the intercultural dialogue in it, and so on? And so to say that even for me it was a question I never thought about, I didn't even could think about it, but then I didn't have any special block to start thinking about it. And the people that I encountered, I just found out that, well, it's not only that they had not thought about it, but it was unthinkable for them. Or when you started to do it, it really started to very, very deeply shake their self-understanding of who they are in the world.
Okay.
What proved me right or wrong? So what you have to do is when you do any kind of work which is departing from mainstream opinion, put it like that, well, you have to be very, very, very thorough in argumenting. If you say human rights are wonderful and France is the country of human rights, in France you don't need to have much proof. Because people will agree with you. At the moment you start to try to say something different, just even mentioning a word already triggers so many reactions that you really have to know why are you using the words that you use. How do you back it up? How do you explain what you're doing? How do you, if I take a legal language, how to build your case? In such a way that on the one hand it can be heard, so you also have to take people little by little and open things up more and more, because, for example, part of the human rights debate, there are cultural rights in the human rights debate. There is an African Charter of Human Rights. So there are certain things in the field of rights which open up already to other cultures. And so the thing was how to little by little, and then there was problems that human rights lawyers or human rights activists were encountering in practice, where they would see the gap which is there between their theories and then the practice, the grassroots practices. And we also had this feeling that, well, it may have something to do with social, cultural conditions that maybe we did not always take into account enough. And so I would say what I tried to do is, on the one hand, to, well, very well argue everything that I was saying, and at the same time to try to have, I would say, pedagogic kind of approach, where I just try to take people little by little from what they know and then open up more and more their field of vision. And of course there are some people that may want to come along with you, and it's not always easy. I mean, for myself, it was not only intellectual challenges, but I did have in my process of doing my research on intercultural questions, I had existential crises.
Yes.
It's not only like intellectual questions. When you really take these things seriously, there's moments where you do lose your, in French, repère, you know, your, what to say, your
values,
reference.
Yeah, reference.
And so I can understand very much that not everybody wants to do that. And so you have this defensive reaction, you know, where you say, no, I don't want to go there.
To protect themselves or...
Yeah, instead of saying, well, I don't want to go there, obviously the way that you defend yourself is, no, this cannot be done. No, this is stupid. No, this is nonsense. No, this, whatever, you know? You project projection in an objective way. So what I tried to do on one hand, so I started this with my first master thesis I wrote in my laboratoire in 95, 96, and then I continued to do it at the European Academy of Legal Theory, is just very patiently and little by little, try to give the tools to people to understand how we could approach that kind of question which may seem non-approachable or non-thinkable. That's on my side. And then I've been doing this for the last almost like 20 years now. I mean, whatever I'm doing, I'm always trying to do that kind of thing. Now, the second thing that happened is that that's not me so much, it's just like the general evolution of the world, if you want. Remember that 1989 was the breaking down of the Iron Curtain, with this division of, I would say, the West and the communist countries, which kind of crumbled. And so what started to happen is that you had more and more this emergence of a, let's say, more pluripolar world. Although you still have what some call the American empire, which is very much present, but you start to have other things which emerge. You had China emerging, India emerging, Brazil. You had other powers starting to emerge. And also, in the last 20 years, they became much more powerful. So little by little, maybe from one world which was divided in two worlds, and maybe a third world, we started to enter more and more what I sometimes say we left the universe for a pluriverse. Where this idea of globalization became more and more important. And the globalization started to mean understand the global and local relationship. And so that probably helped to make the message audible, because if you go back to the end of the 90s, end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, see all the questions of human rights and intercultural dialogue, it was a very kind of theoretical debate. But there's this question, universalism versus relativism. Can you be at the same time universalist and relativist? My thing was, maybe you can be more pluralistic. Second thing was, is there a possible to bridge the gap between theories and practices? Yes, maybe you can have a more pragmatic approach. But at the same time, the whole framework was a very much, let's say, abstract framework. Now with globalization, what started to happen is little by little, and you find the same thing actually in the general evolution of the social sciences, for example, like in anthropology. Instead of talking so much about what is universal and what is relative in the different cultures, there's a second couple which started to be very much present and gain more and more prominence, which is this global-local. And which is, there are global things and at the same time they interact with the local. So there's terms of the glocal, G-L-O-C-A-L, so the in-between of global and local. So in a certain way, not exactly, but global-local is somehow a bit, it echoes the universalism, relativism debate, Because we have like global human rights, but how do you translate the global human rights into local practices? How do you translate local problems into global human rights agendas? And so, because of this shift, what started to happen is, see, when we talk about global, local, we talk about real lives. We talk about real dynamics. In real life, well, things may be very complex, but they do not contradict each other. They coexist.
Yes.
So I think that in the last, since the beginning of the 1990s, there was this trend in research to move more to this global, local approach, which is a more action-based, let's say, kind of approach. And so which in a certain way made it more easy to start to talk about differences, not in a big philosophical debate about can there be unity and difference at the same time, but just by trying to understand what was going on. At the same time, I mean, there's another word that became very, very important, and which you also have to keep in mind. So we said globalization is one of them. The other one is governance. Because before, when we thought about law, well, it was government. It's a state. The state obviously has the monopoly of law. So in all the corporations that, for example, the French state had with its ex-colonies and so on, whenever you were talking about law, you did talk about state law. And whenever you had somebody saying, look, in this or that African context, maybe the state law is only 5% of the real law in a country, and you have all these other laws, the living laws, alternative practices of laws, or whatever you may call them, well, the jurists may listen, but then they will just say, okay, that's nice, but we are not concerned with this because we are talking about law. And your thing is not law. It's not state law, so it's not law. It's whatever you want. It's sociological. But we don't have to deal with this.
Like separated.
It's separated because the state is doing one thing and then the other thing is society. That's something different. Now, what changed with governance is that the big word, which is maybe at the center of governance, is the idea of participation. Participation means that, well, all the different stakeholders, that's the other word that is used very much, so all the people who have a stake in a problem must somehow be heard. So at the moment you say this, it means we do have to listen. If we want to build a rule of law in, I don't know, Mali, well, we do have to listen and to understand what are the things that make sense for people in Mali. What are the logics that they function on? What are the institutions that they may have, even if they are not official institutions? And so you started to put it in a certain way. I mean, I'm giving more the positive side of things, okay? We could also criticize. But the positive thing that happened is that maybe from a logic which was more a logic of exclusion, very segmentary logic, state does one thing, economic does one thing, law does one thing, sociology does one thing, and those things do not really interact, we move to an approach which is more, let's say, holistic or interdependent. Now you want to governance or think of sustainable development. What is sustainable development? It's the environment, it's the society, it's the economic, all this together. You know, we have to find the in-betweens. And so I think that, so generally speaking, in the last 15, 20 years, what has changed very much is, on the one hand, so the world has become more pluripolar. You have these like powers which emerge more and more, so little by little we have to deal more, go into schools in Belgium or in France, so you can learn Chinese now there. 10 years ago you couldn't learn Chinese so much. So there is this awareness that we are not anymore the only people around. And at the same time, because of this concept of globalization governance, also an approach which is maybe more focusing on what is really going on like processes of what is going on. And so in a certain way, leaving this idea of principle of non-contradiction and of separating things into principle more of complementarity of differences. So I would say that's maybe the things which have changed. And so I am happy. I mean, I'm not saying that I was the one who changed this or whatever, but I'm just happy to see that over the last 10, 20 years, little by little you started to have more and more also other anthropologists starting to work on these questions of like human rights, intercultural dialogue, human rights between the global and the local. And actually like 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, I mean, I was very happy I received the report of the Council of Human Rights Policies in in Geneva, where it made a whole report on human rights and legal pluralism. So, which were things probably like 10 or 15 years ago, it was kind of unthinkable. So
it's an evolution,
and I might just say one other thing, because there's also cycles. So now maybe things are opening up a little more. But you should not forget that, like, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was actually drafted, like in the end of the Second World War, there had been anthropologists who had already been saying that kind of thing. They said, there may be a problem, of just like assuming that we have a universal.
From the beginning,
You even had a statement by the American American Anthropological Association, who already criticized that kind of things. But then, because of political reasons, because all kinds of things, we didn't listen to that too much, and we were in this idea of progress, development, and the West is progress and development, and we have to be civilized, and so we didn't listen to it so much. And now with the new questions coming up, some space is given to it, and there I would just say like one little sentence, and then we can maybe go to the next point, which just is the problem with it becoming very popular now is that it's become like a fashion, so it's like, so we have to have intercultural dialogue and that will solve all the problems, It's kind of a fashion, it's a trend, and so because it becomes a trend, even people who don't really know about it, when start to talk about it, because that's how maybe you can get some contracts, or you can, whatever, it's, so we start doing it, and again, we may start to do it as we want to sell it, now it's a new thing, you have to be dialogical, you have to be intercultural and so on. And so because you want to sell it, you don't want to focus again on the whole difficulties. It is not that intercultural dialogue is a universal, I don't know how you say that in English, like panacée universelle, panacée, I don't know how you pronounce in English. It's not saying, let's just dialogue and we will all love each other. We have to dialogue, and I think we are more and more confronted to a situation where we want it or not want it. We have to dialogue. At the same time, when you really start to dialogue, it's also painful. And Bert Vachon, whom I like very much, was the director of the Intercultural Institute of Montreal and the director of its journal Interculture. He always likes to say very much, intercultural dialogue, he says, is crucifying. And then he adds, but liberating. But very often we only hear the but liberating and we don't hear the crucifying.
The first.
And the question is, how do we, in a context where now it's so wonderful to dialogue, how do we get the idea across? Wonderful, but real dialogue means that I also must listen to other points of view. I must take them seriously. They may challenge me very deeply. So this takes time also, because I cannot understand things by just having read them once or something. That's where the anthropological idea of spending time, for example, in the country that you want to study is very important. And then over the years, little by little, and you hear things, you're experiencing things, and sometimes things are in front of your eyes, you don't see them, and then you don't realize them. And then only little by little, you start to realize, and then sometimes you start to realize, and it scares you, so you don't want to let it get nearer to you. So how to accept? So it's not only like an intellectual journey, but it's also a very existential journey. And so I would say, what you said at the beginning, so what was the problem and how did I try to get people to change their minds, is maybe I think you really have to respect the fact that we are human beings and we cannot change like this. It's difficult, So it's also, I've started to understand that, for example, the kind of work that I'm doing will not appeal to everybody. There will be some lawyers who will not be able to hear me and will maybe not be able to hear me for another 10 or 20 years. At the beginning, I wanted to convince everybody, it was like, we have to get this new awareness or something. And now I just realized, there's some people who are confronted to certain problems, so those people I try to provide a certain number of tools which may help them, doing their own path, to maybe explore and see things in a different light. But at the same time, you also have to respect that there's some people who may not have this sensitivity, who may not be interested. And it is also very necessary, especially in the human rights field, of having some people who are more, let's say, militant, say, no, I don't care about all this, like, cultural bullshit, this is wrong, and that's why I criticize it. And it's very important that you have these people also. So the last point I want to bring is that when you try to enter more like dialogue approach, yeah, what I'm trying to share is this sensitivity of dialogue, which does not mean that I'm necessarily not agreeing also, at the same time, with some people sometimes have not a very dialogical approach, but where I think if we only had the dialogical approach, where sometimes it's very difficult, because it takes so much time, and then you find yourself in a situation where you cannot act on certain things,
Yes.
But I'm like, also this should be kept in mind.
Okay, thank you. I just have a second question, more about India, as you have just come back from India. I wanted to ask you, have you seen an evolution according to your experience in the country these past few years, more specifically concerning women's rights issues?
Okay, so first thing I would say, before exactly answering your question, India is really for me the country which started to crystallize the idea that it is possible to have pluralism. Because coming from the French context where there is really not so much pluralism actually, and then I studied 1 year in India, in Delhi, like from 94 to 95, and there I had my Sikh friends and my Jain friends and my Muslim friends and my Hindu friends, and then you had the different castes and the different languages and the different regions. So it's a huge pool of pluralism. And somehow this pluralism also exists in the public space. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like in the French laïcité, the idea is like, you can do whatever you want, but you do it at home, basically. Yes. And there you had like the Indian secular state, which in a certain way even promotes all the different differences. So that for me was very challenging at the beginning, and it really inspired me very much in order to say, oh, it is possible to think in another way than our universalistic way. At the same time, little by little, what I started to realize is that, I make a little shortcut, but just to illustrate what I'm trying to say, that because in India the idea of pluralism is so strong, and you have this thing of like castes, for example, that you belong to. Well, the caste, jati is like, it means color, or it means like, varna means color, like jati is like one way of species. It's like tigers, lions, cows. So a cow is vegetarian, a tiger eats meat. It doesn't pose you any problem because, well, they have a different nature. So they can coexist, but at the same time, what I found out is that the maybe European universalistic outlook is missing. Because I may accept that my Muslim neighbor does something, or the guy from the other caste is doing something, and so on and so on, but it doesn't really challenge me as a human being. Because in my mind, he's a different kind of human being than I am. So that's why I can do whatever he needs to do, and what I have to. And so I found that actually, like there is a beauty in the European tradition, which is the one thing I've been criticizing. At the same time, it's very important. It's this universalistic attitude. It's because for me there is like a universal human being. We have this in law. That's why everybody is supposed to have human rights. Whoever he, whatever color he is, whatever language he is, whatever gender he is, whatever age he is, it's a human being, and so that's why he has human rights. And in anthropology, well, everybody is also human, and so we're interested, how do humans live together? And then that poses me a problem, because I have some humans who function very differently from me. Why is it a problem for me? Why is it an existential shock for me? Well, because I'm feeling he's human and I'm human, and though he's experiencing things in a very different way. So it shocks me very much. If I don't consider that there is this universal underlying ground, I'm not shocked. Because
you don't react.
So I just wanted to give this, like as a background, because sometimes when I do find myself in India, again, see, we're talking about context, I may emphasize more the universalistic aspect of pluralism. When I'm in France, because everybody is the universalistic aspect, I have to emphasize a bit more, let's say, the difference aspect. So it's also, although I always try to give everything, you know, a little, so that people understand that I'm not trying to be relativistic and so on and so on.
Yes.
But the emphasis, where you will put the emphasis, will be different according to the context where you're talking. Now, to come to the questions of women's rights, well, you see, there again, you have there's different things going on. One thing that I would just want to say before is that there always has been, for women's rights, or generally speaking, like for different kinds of rights in India, there have always been internal struggles. It's not that it's just because now there's like international human rights that some people start to say, we want to change our way of being. You always had inside of the Buddhist, Indian traditions, criticisms of the Indian traditions. You know, like cultures are not homogeneous. There's many different things. And so I had this lapsus of Buddhism. Yeah, see, like if you go 2,500 years back, the Buddhist approach, which is the Indian approach, I mean, the Buddha was basically a Hindu, challenged the whole caste system already at that time. Reinterpreting the notion of dharma, the cosmic order, which is then also the order in the society, and so which reflects in your swadharma, what your dharma, your duty in the whole is, or your place in the whole is. In the Hindu approach, this is a very social interpretation. Your dharma is according to varna, ashrama, dharma. So what is the caste you're in, and what is the stage in life you're in, and that very much determines what your dharma is. Now the Buddha took this, and his idea of swadharma is much, much more individualistic, and challenged, you know, this whole idea of, I would say, rigid outside social order which describes where you are. So that's the first thing I want to say is never forget that the evolutions are in relationship, like with inputs from different cultures, new situations and so on, but they're not only from outside. Okay? But there's also like internal change. Now, what happened in the last years, I mean, India has been changing a lot. Really a lot. One of the things you do see, apparently the call centers had a quite big impact in this. You know, the call centers like where people can call for getting problems solved. So lots of them were in India, still are in India.
Yeah, I watched a documentary about that.
You've seen that? And so the thing is, well, those people usually work at night, you know, because like your clients are in the United States.
They have to adapt.
So you work at a time which is a strange time. Usually, I mean, girls were not really supposed to be out, you know, after like 8 or 9 o'clock or whatever. So now you work from 8 to 5 o'clock. You earn some money, not bad money considering like other salaries. And plus it's not only the language, but you have to know a little about the American culture, you know, so that you can interact with your
Yes, they
customers.
have English courses.
And so you did have quite some impact actually from people there, and then developing a certain culture where after your work you would go and have some coffee, you know, in some of the more modern cafes, you know, which would exist and so on. So these things happened, and the media, cinemas, like you start to see more Western movies. I mean, Bollywood is a huge industry. Like, it's there since the Indian cinema emerged at the same time than the Western cinema emerged. So they have more than a century of history. But now what is happening more and more is that you start to see more English movies, or let's say Western movies. You also start to have more and more Indian filmmakers who are what they call like these non-resident Indians. You know, like the Indians who are living in Great Britain or Canada or like immigrant community. And who start to make Bollywood movies about that kind of questions. You know, where there's questions then of divorce, of questions which you would not really find in the, let's say, more traditional or older Bollywood movies. So on the one hand, there is a big impact, I would say, of the, let's say, Western or modern or whatever lifestyle in India. And you do see it more in certain cities than in others. I mean, I remember like 2 or 3 years back, I had to go to Bangalore, which is supposed to be one more cosmopolitan city in South India, the Indian Silicon Valley. And I remember I was walking on the streets, and suddenly I almost had a shock. You know, like, oh, you know, what's this? And what happened is that there was an Indian guy and the Indian girl walking hand in hand, you know, on the on the walkway. And it just made me realize that usually you don't really see that kind of things in India. You didn't see it so much. I mean, I wasn't missing it, when it was not there. But then suddenly of seeing this in Indian Bangalore, I had like, oops, what's going on here? Shock, And I was like, interesting. So things are changing. There's certain ways of behaving which you didn't have before, which start to be there. So there is a change. Now, the problem that you have is that you find yourself change also means that you're in a moment of change. And I don't have time now because that would take an hour or more to go into the details. But see, the problem that you had is woman had a certain status, let's say in the traditional society. Which maybe from a certain feminist point of view is not a good status because you're ascribed your role, you're the one who is in charge of the home and who is in charge of the kitchen and who is in charge of all that kind of things. So it was quite defined what your role was, but at the same time this role also gave you a certain power. I will just give you like one example. I mean, it's of course more complex than that, but just to imagine what we're talking about. Like when you were a woman, like in a traditional Indian family, let's say more high caste family, okay, you're the daughter-in-law, with very little you have a son, you have the keys, you're running the home, and you're cooking for everybody. Now in the castes, one of my friends told me, I think once every 2 weeks, I think, they invited the whole caste for eating. That means like 1,000 people.
Wow.
Okay? You're responsible for cooking for these 1,000 people. Now imagine that you have some problems with your husband. Your husband doesn't treat you well, or he doesn't want to listen to you, or whatever. You try to get him to understand. He doesn't understand. But for your next dinner, I don't know, you don't put enough salt, something like this. Your cooking is not up to the mark. What's going to happen? People will start to talk. What's happening? Does she have some problems? Why is the food not good today? And 1,000 people, the whole cast is talking about this. If it happens once, okay, it was just like, I don't know, whatever. Imagine, and then your husband says, oh, what happened? You didn't cook properly. You get again to try to get your message across. You don't get it? Next time you do the same thing or you do worse. Then people will really start to talk and think. So you have, because of your position, it's just one example among many others. Because of your position gives you lots of power. Lots of indirect power, pointing power, finger pointing power. Same thing with the caste, like you're marrying your girl, like from one village you took the girls from another village. You heard that your girl is not treated nicely in the family-in-law. It becomes a debate. At some point the people from the caste will say, if that doesn't stop, you will not marry any girls anymore from our village. So you had all these counterpowers which were also there. I'm not saying that you're like in the same idea of, let's say, equality of women and men in the sense that everybody can do the same things, do the same jobs. No, there was a differentiation in what everybody was doing. But at the same time, I would say from the protection of your life, it's also not always perfect. And like any system, no system is perfect. But there were certain counterpowers. Now what started to happen is that for many, like the whole lifestyle becomes more individualized. Just imagine the lady that we were talking before. Now you move into one of the big cities, you're far away from your village, from the caste, and so on and so on. You still have the role that you still have to cook for your husband and all these things. But you do not receive your caste anymore. You do not have that kind of things anymore. You don't have any power anymore that you can use against your husband. So you find yourself in a situation where the traditional things that may have protected you do not protect you anymore. At the same time, the modern protections, which should be there in order to protect you in that kind of modern setting, very often, for the moment, I mean, they're making lots of efforts, but they still do not really, they're not up to what they're supposed to do. And you still have also lots of, I can say, very sexist points of views at the police station. So it's still, I mean, it's even in Belgium or France, you know, like try to go to a police station, like to file your case for rape or this kind of thing is not so easy. Now in India, probably it's even a little less easy. So the situation you're in, there is definitely lots of change, and I would say change which is going towards a more like also individualization. So maybe like the Western point of view, emancipation of women in the sense of that they can now, especially in the cities, you see it like you'll have more women also wearing, I don't know, jeans or wearing more Western clothes or like their own job, also earning money. So these things start to be there more and more. At the same time, I talked with one of my Indian friends, like she's older now, she's like 70 or something, but she said like she observed over like her lifespan, she feels that probably at the moment the Indian woman is in a very, very fragile situation. And maybe also because of another aspect, which is that because we are in a moment of change, and traditionally, I mean, it's like this, maybe because of this like more patriarchal points of view, that the ones who always have to bear, you know, like the purity of the caste and whatever, it's always the woman. And so in a certain way, you know, when you have moments of crisis, a moment of change, which is always coming together, well, people sometimes get even more stuck on certain things. You know, they want to have some fixed references. When you want to find the fixed references, you want to find it again, like this discourse, it's the woman, you know? So the woman have to be especially controlled, the woman have to be, and so on. So, to say that, I don't know, I didn't make any studies, so I don't know if women's rights are more respected now than they were before. The discourse on women's rights is definitely more. I mean, now you have seen also the whole Indian questioning of themselves, like with the recent rape cases, you know, that happened. So, I mean, the rape cases are nothing new. I mean, whenever you open a newspaper, I mean, those things are going on. But what is new is that suddenly now it has become like a national debate.
Okay, and before it was not heard. Maybe.
Yeah, and so there is things that are talked about that maybe were not so much talked about before. There's also, as I was telling you, like movie makers, you know, who start to make movies about some topics which in French would say des sujets qui fâchent.
Controversial, maybe.
Controversial. And before, like all this more controversial thing was more like art cinema. People would not watch it so much. And now, little by little, it's in Bollywood movies, you know, that you start to have these things like, I remember that was like 2 or 3 years back, I don't remember, when I was flying to India and I was in the airplane and I was watching one Bollywood movie. And like you see the storyline, and little by little you really start to feel like the one lady, I mean, she's going to divorce. I mean, logically that's what's going to happen, you know. And then you're like, how are they going to do it that they won't get divorced because I'm watching a Bollywood movie, you know? And they did get divorced in the movie. And I'm like, oh wow, you know, see. So these things, there's things which are changing here. So there's certain things which are being put now, I would say, in the discussion field of what can be discussed, or at least by some people what can be discussed, which were not before. And now I think what we have to see is, well, where is this going? And then what I would find important is, well, as I tried to say it here, to see it in a balanced way, you know, you're winning things, you're losing things.
Yes.
You know? And the thing is, how do you, instead of being, I had an Indian friend of mine with whom we actually worked on some issues of women's rights in India. And where very often, you know, you have, I don't know, like one woman is suffering from something, she has a problem in her village or something like this, and then something happens, she gets beaten up, or it becomes a court case, and very often there's still this tendency of polarizing, you know, of on the one hand having the people who say, oh look, this is the traditional backward Indian ways of doing that we have to overcome with human rights, we have to civilize all these barbarian grassroots Indians or whatever. So that's one point of view, let's say, of the human rights activists. And then from the other point of view, we would have the people saying, why are all these things happening? Because the good old India with our respect of tradition is disappearing, and it's because these modern things are coming in and are creating chaos, and there's no respect anymore, and so on and so on and so on. As long as you have this polarization of the debate, on tradition is wonderful and modernity is bad, or modernity is wonderful and traditions are bad, well, you're missing the point of looking at what is actually going on, and how in concrete situations you may just be able to find maybe more humane solutions. Knowing that they also, it's not like when I'm saying more humane, not everybody will agree. We're always like in some power struggles. I may find that certain things are humane, somebody else may not find it. I mean, that's also what politics is about, You find that you should be communist, the other guy finds you should be a capitalist, that's the life. But the important thing is to not shy away. I mean, that would be like my kind of message, or what I was trying to do in my research and my teachings. Not to shy away from this complexity. Leave possibility for doubt. Leave the possibility to say, maybe we don't understand everything. We do not need to understand everything. We do not need to have like the theory which explains everything. But in a certain situation, what are the tools? There are modern tools. We have the tools of human rights. We have an Indian judiciary. We have even like a special commission for women's rights in India. We have all these things. How can we use it in a way that that makes sense? And also, we have traditions. We have things that we can rely on. We have like alternative practices of law. Same thing. Again, what can we take from there? But I know it's very difficult in a certain way, because usually, well, we don't want to have too many doubts. We rather want to have certainties, and we want to have the perfect toolkit, like even in intercultural communication, like the to have the good communication.
Like, simple. Yeah.
But maybe what's important also is, do we little by little allow the time and allow ourselves to develop an attitude of listening, respecting, which then can also lead, see, with my Indian friends, sometimes I'm saying things, I know that I'm kind of shocking them a little, you know? But why can I do it? Because we have a relationship. See, it's the importance of relationship. It also takes time. You build up a relationship. There is some trust. And because we trust each other, because I accept their things, I respect their things, they start to respect us what I'm saying.
Yes,
and sometimes we don't agree exactly on what we are thinking, or we say, oh, okay, so I just keep it in my mind, and then maybe in one way or another, it still may have a certain influence. And so to come back, to what you were asking at the beginning on the human rights question, more generally speaking, it's the same thing, it's like you have the discussion, and you just have to. I think it's really important to understand where people are, and I just remember for me, I told it was quite a few existential crises to come to the points of view that I have now, and it took me. I started to explicitly be interested in how do we perceive the world in relationship with language when I was like 10 years old. When I was 10 years old, maybe you have read that now, because I found out that communication students do learn that actually. For me, it was my childhood literature. I was reading all this like Paul Watzlawick.
Yes.
That was when I was 10 years old, that's what I was reading. That's what I enjoyed reading, like how real is reality and all that kind of things. So I've been really into that kind of, and then learning the Chinese martial arts, the Indian yoga. So also learning things in the way that they do it, So I've been doing lots of things in my whole life, and still it was so many challenges and existential crises. So of course I must also understand, that I cannot take anybody like in one interview, or even if we have like a semester. You have had some of the classes with me. You just try to wake up something, and hope that maybe for some people it will resonate a bit, and then that trying to give at least some tools. That is why, for example, in our classes I was talking about this alterity, complexity, interculturality. Why? It's just because at some points, maybe even if you forget all the rest, there is something, these things may in your own way help you to go your own path at a certain way. So that's what I would say.
Okay, thank you very much for the interview, and have a good day.
Thank you.